My name really is Andrew Shikiar. I'm the Executive Director and CEO at FIDO Alliance. How many of you were here last year? Okay. So I'm going to start my talk today talking about accountability. So I'm a big believer in accountability. It's something I preach to my kids and I try to hold all of our employees to, something I try to hold myself to. So in the spirit of accountability, how many of you remember last year I promised that I would bring FIDO socks? Okay, I did not. So I'm holding myself accountable. Yes, boo me, I deserve it, but I promise you, for real this time, if I'm here next year, there will be FIDO socks aplenty to complement those from Better Identity Coalition. So I am going to talk to you today about accountability. I'm going to talk to you about authentication and securing, securing the internet through better sign-ins with Passkeys. But on the spirit of accountability, this is different. These are not building, but that's fine. So I want to go through 2024 predictions. Let's look at what we said last year and see how we did against these. So the first prediction we made is that AI will drive cyber attacks, but not how people expect. And what I meant by that is that, even at this point last year, there's a lot of talk about deepfakes. But our feeling was that the most present threat from AI was in better social engineering. And that unfortunately bore out, right? And I'll show some statistics today about how phishing has increased exponentially. In James's presentation earlier today, he talked about the spike in attacks and successful breaches from 22 to 23. That is directly tied to generative AI. And so this prediction did come true, right? So deepfakes were a threat, but AI-driven social engineering was a greater threat, and we're seeing that in spades. The second prediction we had is that Passkeys would march towards 20 billion enabled accounts. So it did. I think at last year at this point, we had around 4 billion or so enabled accounts, meaning those that could enroll a passkey. Right now, we estimate we're over 15 billion. So we've seen great progress there, and more and more services worldwide have given their consumers an option to use a passkey instead of using a password. We had two other predictions as well. One is that businesses' cybersecurity laundry will be aired in public, and a corresponding prediction that cyber scrutiny would force competition and accountability in the cloud. So the first one is really tied towards the SEC data breach requirements in late 2023, and we did see this. So, James' presentation today, the point of view is that it didn't have much impact. I'd argue that it actually, being aired in public and having this level of visibility and accountability, it did happen, right? So if you didn't think it happened, just ask companies like Avaya and Checkpoint and others who faced multi-million-dollar fines for their breaches. But I think it should be driving better behavior, right? So there's a reputational cost associated with being outed for having a breach and having to disclose these breaches. We see that as a good thing because more accountability should drive better business practices, better technology practices. The last point was really about trying to have cloud service providers, focus more on having better authentication practices internally, right? So if someone's in the business of managing your data, managing your business as an outsourced cloud service provider, at minimum, we'd like to see these companies have kind of SLA grade commitments to admins using unphishable authentication. Because we saw multiple breaches in 2023 and earlier where the CSPs themselves were targeted and the admins were targeted, which then not only impacted that company, but all the companies that were relying on them. So the last one's still kind of a work in progress and something we hope to see improve moving forward. So I'm going to talk to you about the middle piece, which is Passkeys, user authentication. And I've been talking about Passkeys and user authentication for many years now, but more and more, I think it's really critical that we look at the entire account lifecycle, right? So while Passkeys absolutely and user authentication is a critical element, and that's been the focal point for so many attacks over the past several years, we're talking about phishing, credential stuffing, all the remote attacks that are facilitated by depending on knowledge-based credentials and passwords and things like that. It's really important that we actually look at the entire lifecycle, right? And that starts with account enrollment and identity verification. All right, so we want to make sure that we're aware of the risks that are happening today and implement better practices. So today, we're facing risks associated with relying on knowledge-based authentication, right? We've heard about, and we all know about the fact that, most of these secrets, many of the secrets that are used for knowledge-based authentication are really not so secret, right? They're out there in the dark web. We know that people are using synthetic identities. We know that, there are fake biometrics injection attacks. We've seen all the negative impacts of this. These are the risks today, and I'm going to talk to you today about what we're doing as an alliance to help address this with many of the stakeholders in this room. As a result of weak account enrollment and weak user authentication, account recovery, remains a wide open backdoor for social engineers and hackers. Right, the account recovery process is probably the highest risk activity any service provider has when it comes to managing their customer base. Because how do you know that the person who's trying to recover their account truly is that person, right? And then how do you train your IT support desk to, on one hand, you're telling me, very friendly and customer aware. How do you get them to not get spoofed by a well-informed social engineer who is pulling, again, data from the public web, not even the dark web, and just doing some basic research to social engineer them out of credentials that they shouldn't be handing over. So these are the risks today that we are systematically trying to address one by one. But let's start with Passkeys. Right. So why Passkeys? If you don't know the answer to this question, I hope you do. The number one reason why is because, long story short, passwords suck. Right. We know this, and we could spend all day with slide after slide with data like this that talks about the risks and the damages associated with passwords. Right. The vast majority of data breaches are caused by passwords. Passwords cause and exacerbate bad authentication practices. Right. So the most people reuse or use and then reuse weak passwords. Right. Password policies vary from site to site, from company to company. And so that, depending on them is inherently difficult and inherently risky. And so it leads to massive losses. It leads to breaches. And not only is there direct cost associated with fraud, there's also opportunity cost for e-commerce providers, say. So we find that close to 50% of people who need to reset a password during a purchase actually abandon that purchase. Right? So there's opportunity costs also associated with passwords and transactions not happening. And the answer we've had for years now has been to, we understand passwords are weak. Let's add a layer on top of that. So again, layering on does not work. So there are too many ways to bypass legacy MFA. SMS OTP is not secure, right? NIST says so. We all know this inherently, and so we need more and more organizations to understand that you may have a bad foundation, but also building a weak second factor on top of a weak foundation simply does not work either, right? Because there's off-the-shelf MFA bypass toolkits. Generative AI is making this much easier to scale MFA bypass attacks, and it's happening at massive scale. So it comes to the other point, which is that generative AI is indeed adding fuel to the phishing fire. So just one data point here, and we saw this with James' stat too. Since the end of 2022, there's over 4,000% increase in malicious phishing emails. That's a staggering number in just 2 years. And there's a direct line between the release of generative AI tools and this data point. And one reason why that's happening is that they're good. Right? These tools are very effective. It makes it easy, more cost-effective to deliver very believable social engineering messages and phishing attacks. So most of us, we could all spot phishing attacks normally. We get phishing messages, and they're getting better. The ones I see are getting more and more believable, and then I'm pretty attuned to these things. But now, think about this on a global scale. Right? With generative AI, you can now deliver in any language a grammatically perfect message to anyone on the planet trying to phish their credentials, and they're getting these links. People who may also be a little less savvy, newer to the connected economy, they're getting these links, getting these messages, and being taken to a pixel-perfect phishing site. Right? This is the threat that's happening today. Right? And this is happening at massive scale, and it's not getting much better. And so as we understand this threat, and this is the same threat we talked about last year, which is why I was saying, the deepfakes, yes, they are a threat, but the social engineering threat is more critical. Since we do understand this, we need to make this fundamental pivot. Right? We need to understand that we need to address the threat vector, which is phishing. And the best way to implement to fight this is with a phishing-resistant authentication mechanism. Right? A single factor in a passkey is much better than two weak factors or legacy factors that are hard to implement and hard to maintain. And so that's why we're going to talk about passkeys. Now, important to note, I've shown this exact same slide now for close to 8 years. And I think that's wonderful, because what this tells me is that FIDO Alliance, we haven't really swayed from our initial vision, from our initial purpose. Right? Many of you, Liz, you were part of FIDO Alliance forever, and you've seen this slide for a long time. I think part of what's made us successful is this unwavering focus on simpler, stronger authentication. Right? Authentication that is both easier to use and stronger than passwords, OTPs, and legacy forms of 2FA. And we do this by creating open standards for asymmetric, user-friendly public key cryptography. Now, we've definitely had to pivot here and there, but this has been our North Star all along. And part of the pivot actually has been introducing new terminology and new capabilities back in 2022 called passkeys. Right? So we introduced this term. There's never a common term for passwordless FIDO credentials before. We now have a term, we have some iconography, and it's called passkeys. Right? And so we introduced this at the same time as we enabled a fundamental technical change also, which is for the private key and the FIDO key pair to be able to be synchronized securely over an operating system or device cloud. Right? And that means that the user's FIDO credential can be readily available across all their devices without forcing them to re-enroll every device for every service. Now, you can still implement a device-bound passkey on things like a FIDO security key. And you can see the two kind of variants of passkeys, if you will, in the same chart that we have. One features even greater usability, and one features even higher security for higher assurance scenarios. But both of these are leaps and bounds better than their predecessors and the alternatives. Both of these squarely meet the phishing challenge head on, because they're all phishing resistant means of user authentication. And the fact that they're usable is so important. Right? I mean, there's a long history of phishing resistant MFA that's sitting in the dustbin because it wasn't usable. Right? If your MFA is too hard to use, your consumers will not opt in, and your employees will find workarounds. So this combination of usability and security is absolutely critical, and that's the bar that we set for ourselves and that we're meeting today with passkeys. So this is kind of a brief view on how this all comes together. It's actually a build slide, but the top part of that, this is the same FIDO security model we've had since our inception, where you have an authenticator that the user must be in possession of to complete the authentication. The difference now is that the key can be synced across the cloud. And so the use case here, for example, if you're like an Apple user, you enroll for a passkey with a service on your iPhone. When you show up on your iCloud or your MacBook, that passkey is automatically there. Whereas in the past, you'd have to enroll that as well, which actually forces the service provider to essentially run a recovery process. And as I talked about at the outset, recovery is actually a very high-risk activity. So eliminating the recovery process is both a benefit to the consumer and a security benefit to the relying party as well. So passkeys have been out for a bit. We're seeing strong adoption, and that's in large part due to this. Right? These are the operating systems and browsers and environments that support passkeys. And if you're thinking, wow, that looks like just about everything, you're correct. It's just about everything. And this took a long time, right? A lot of FIDO's foundational work and working with the W3C was getting this platform support for FIDO authentication built into virtually every modern computing device, virtually every modern browser now supports passkeys. So as a result, if you are a service provider, you know that you can deploy passkeys with confidence that your consumers can consume them. And so we've seen strong adoption. All right, since passkeys were first actually enabled in October 2022 and really at scale in early 2023, we've seen over 15 billion accounts, as said before, now can support passkeys. This represents many of the top sites on the web. So over 20% of the web's top 100 websites and services give those consumers an option to use passkeys instead of passwords. So we feel pretty good about this progress in the past 2 years, with more to come moving forward. Some examples, so these, here's 4 companies, 4 consumer-centric implementations: Microsoft, DocuSign, Mercari, Air New Zealand. Generally, if I'm a consumer service provider, I want to implement Passkeys to make it easier for my consumers to sign in, while also protecting them from phishing. But KPIs these companies typically look for are faster sign-in time and higher sign-in success rate. So I don't know if you can see the small print, but you see that represented across most of these companies. Now, also, there's other benefits that come from Passkeys as well. So you see for DocuSign, for example, they had a reduction in password reset costs, right, associated with this. Generally, companies are finding decreased OTP costs. Air New Zealand, found a 50% reduction in abandonment rates. So there's a lot of secondary effects, but generally, the 2 core KPIs on the consumer front are how fast can someone sign in and how successful are they in doing so. And in both times, the metrics are moving up with Passkeys. More examples here. Amazon. Paul Grossi was going to be here with us today, but he's not. He's sick. Amazon has implemented Passkeys. Over 175 million Amazon customers have enrolled in Passkey in just over a year, which is amazing. Google has over 800 million accounts using Passkeys to sign in. Right, and they've added up to over 2.5 billion sign-ins using Passkeys. Sony's PlayStation introduced Passkeys and introduced the option to eliminate the password altogether, which over 88% of users have done. eBay, and frankly, the list goes on, right? But generally, the earliest adopters of Passkeys have been, payments and e-commerce companies that are very interested in getting you online quickly and securely so that you can do business. And that's where we've seen a lot of early consumer adoption. And when you talk about 15, consumers are aware of Passkeys. So we found that 60% of consumers are aware of Passkeys based on our data. Right, we did a survey this past summer, which is up from around 40% in 2022. That's fantastic. Right. So again, part of the reason why we introduced the term Passkeys is that there was nothing there before. Right. Sites supported FIDO, they supported WebAuthn, and you get different directions. Some would say sign in with WebAuthn, which means nothing to anyone outside this room. Right? Some would say use Windows Hello, which doesn't mean anything to a lot of people either. So with Passkey, all of a sudden we have a common term, an iconography that people point to, and we're thrilled that we've seen such strong consumer awareness, which also starts creating pull demand for people to support Passkeys. But also on the enterprise side, close to 70% of organizations say that Passkey deployment is a high or critical priority. And so we're seeing strong enterprise adoption, as we have for years with Passkeys. All right, so FIDO security keys have been rolled out in the workforce for close to a decade now. Generally, the KPIs here are, again, usability, so making sure that employees can sign in and they have access to MFA, and reduce fraud. So these are 4 examples of companies that have rolled out Passkeys to their workforce. IBM has done so globally, as has Alibaba. T-Mobile just came out with a case study with Yubico, I think last week. Over 200,000 employees are using YubiKeys. Another KPI, actually, I did a keynote with the co-CISO at Bank of America, who's rolled out FIDO authentication extensively across B of A. And I asked him, I was like, hey, so what's the biggest change? What's your KPI for rolling out FIDO to all your employees? It's like, well, Andrew, mine's sleep, because I can sleep at night. I can sleep at night now knowing that when the next big social engineering attack comes and sweeps over, the industry, that my employees won't be spoofed. Even if they click on a link, they cannot be hacked because they're using unphishable authentication. All right, so that's a KPI that's being met by enterprises like these worldwide. And then government, right? So we see a lot of government adoption of Passkeys. It's an open standard. FIDO's an open standard. So these are 4 such examples: NHS, Virginia Beach, USDA. There's a case study published by CISA in the state of Michigan. We see governments worldwide at the federal level, the local level, using Passkeys as a means both for easier access to e-citizen services, but also, as we'll talk about, utilization by federal employees and government agencies. Right, this is a best practice to make sure that every government agency is under threat from attackers. This is a way to make sure that that front door is closed, that people don't get phished and don't get hacked by using better authentication. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape and how we look at things. So Jeremy, I borrowed this slide from you, but this is, kind of sums up our role in policy. Look, I mean, FIDO specifications offer governments, newer and better options for strong authentication, but that requires updates, right? That requires some critical thinking to understand how policy needs to be updated. So as we say here, as technology evolves, policy needs to evolve with it. And, I'm happy to say, I feel like the narrative on this front has shifted over the past couple of years, right? So when we first introduced Passkeys in late 2022, the feedback was, well, regulators hate it, right? And policies against this. But the fact of the matter is, any and every policy on the books that had anything to do with user authentication was developed years ago, and the only frame of reference was passwords. And how do we make passwords less of a threat? Right? There is no policy that contemplated a password replacement, a true password replacement. And that's what Passkeys do. So when we talk about policy, when we partner with Jeremy and Venable on engaging globally, our objective is to, first of all, ensure that policymakers are educated on FIDO and passkeys and authentication and the identity lifecycle. So we do a lot of this and making sure that people are aware of how this all works and how this comes together. And we want to drive towards policies that call for phishing-resistant, standards-based authentication. And I'll point to some of those in a bit, but we know those are out there. People saying you should use passkeys to protect critical infrastructure, to protect agencies for B2B transactions, things like that. And then last but not least, we also engage with governments directly. And we're very fortunate to have many government members taking part in the alliance. Right, so the US government, the UK government, German government, Korean government, like the list goes. I think we have maybe 8 to 10 or 12 different government members at the national level who come in and sit in our working groups and advise us on what requirements we should be considering for technical specifications, for our best practice guidance, for usability, for use case development. So this is how we engage in government policy on a global scale. And we also push adoption. This is actually, it's an animated slide, so it's really cool and it kind of grows, but here you see the end result, which is that a lot of countries are supporting FIDO authentication in the sense that they are either recommending or requiring FIDO be used in different instances in these countries. Now, ranging from the US to most of Europe to down under to the Pacific Rim, we see strong adoption. And Brazil is a real interesting case in point. So around the middle of last year, we started seeing all these inquiries to our certification team from all these Brazilian banks who wanted to get FIDO2 certified. And this was fantastic news to us. But we dug a little deeper and it turned out that the open banking authority in Brazil required that every bank be FIDO2 certified in order to protect their consumers and protect their infrastructure. So we now see that as a requirement in Brazil. And I know several ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia that are following suit. So more and more we're seeing government not just recommend using unphishable FIDO authentication in the agencies and for e-citizen services, but also to regulated industry. And we hope to see more and more of this moving forward, and that is part of our broader policy objective within FIDO Alliance. Closer to home here in the US, I think everyone's familiar with these activities. The NIST 863 digital identity guidelines, cited unphishable authentication previously, have been updated to contemplate passkeys as meeting AL2. The cybersecurity information sheet on secure SIAM practices came out as well. The federal zero trust strategy, that was a very meaningful milestone in as far as driving zero trust applications and citing FIDO and unphishable authentication as part of that. Then, of course, the CISA compendium to that, the zero trust maturity model, reinforced the importance of that strategy, both for federal agencies and for critical infrastructure in the country. Looking a bit closer at NIST-supported passkeys, this was important to us. NIST has global reach, as I'm sure many of you know, but it's amazing to me, actually, how many of our regulated members outside the US specifically point to NIST. And the question we would get, Jeremy and I would get, was, well, when's NIST going to say passkeys meet AL2? Right, when's this going to happen? And we're really pleased by working with the NIST team that they updated this in 863B to recognize that synced authenticators can meet AL2 when implemented correctly, along with reinforcing the fact that device-bound security keys continue to meet AL3. So that's what we're doing in Passkeys. So I mean, the TLDR there is lots of progress, more work to be done, but use Passkeys. Now beyond Passkeys, let's talk about that a little bit as well. So some of this has been covered today, right? So deepfakes are a problem. So I wasn't trying to minimize it before. I was just trying to prioritize things in 2024, saying that social engineering was a more clear and present threat and deepfakes were emerging. I think it's fair to say deepfakes have emerged. And they're starting to scale. They don't scale like social engineering does. It's still too expensive. But they're a growing problem today. And we're seeing, the ramifications of this, right? So, we heard about how, KnowBe4 hired these North Korean hackers as workers, right? And we know about MGM getting attacked through social engineers, and all these things could be bolstered with better identity verification and better proofing technologies that were not yet implemented. Bias is also an issue, right? You talk about biometric authentication, to get buy-in for this, people need to feel like it represents them and that they have a fair shake. And so bias is very important to contemplate as well as we talk about biometrics. So these are all things that are true problems in the market today. This information sheet from NSA and FBI and CISA, reinforce this. It reinforced the importance of implementing real-time identity verification and liveness detection with MFA. These are all things that people should be heeding, and not just in the government, but of course in the enterprise world as well. And so this is what we're doing to support this space. So in addition to Passkeys for user authentication, this is what we offer on the identity verification and biometric authentication front. So we have a certification suite that includes document authenticity. All right, so how well are the software tools that some companies are using to do DocAuth, how well are those actually reading the documentation? So we have a certification program that tests against that. So the way we do this is to understand, we certify labs, expert labs around the world who are familiar with different types of government issued documents, and they can actually test for performance against this, right? So it tests for authenticity of government issued docs, it verifies the authenticity of the documents themselves, and it ties into the IDV face verification program, right? So the IDV face verification program tests for security, bias, accuracy, and liveness of face biometrics. And these things tie together as you start thinking about a selfie match, right? So the most common form of remote identity verification or proofing is the selfie match, where it's your picture and your government ID. So these things come together in a certified, as a certified product to allow you to know that vendors who are supplying these services can do so in a way that has been verified and tested and certified against industry standards and by a certified lab. The biometric component certification program, tests for the performance against industry standard metrics for test performance of biometric components against industry metrics such as false accept rate, false reject rate, presentation account detection. This is obviously part of the face verification solution, also is offered as a standalone test. And lastly, the biometric component testing complements our certified authenticator program as well. So if you have say a security key that has a biometric component in it, there's different levels that you can achieve based on the biometric performance of that piece of equipment. So all in all, these are things we're doing, beyond just user authentication, beyond just passkeys, to again look at addressing the entire identity lifecycle. So coming back to that, this is where it all kind of ties together, right? So we start with phishing-resistant user authentication with passkeys, but really, we now have processes in place that can help you have confidence in securing the account enrollment and account creation phase, which enables more secure account recovery. You see these little badges at the bottom. We have FIDO certified products. And one thing I think that's really neat about FIDO Alliance is that all we're doing is creating standards. but we run a very robust certification program that's certified hundreds of products. That's certified not just that they meet our specifications, but that they interoperate. So as you're thinking about, well, hey, how do I get started in rolling something out? How to roll out a Passkeys or an IDV system? These are important things to look for. These FIDO certified marks, because you can purchase in confidence in knowing that A, they've met our standards, and B, that they interoperate with other products in the ecosystem, which helps prevent vendor lock-in and really unleashes the power of open standards. So looking ahead, I started with predictions for 2024. In the spirit of accountability, let's make some predictions for 2025. And these are supposed to build, so the suspense is gone, but I ask you not to read ahead. So the first one, Passkeys become a mainstream authentication method. So I guess I'm kind of sandbagging already. This is happening. It'll become even more of a mainstream authentication method. The second one's very important though. Big banks deploy Passkeys at scale and governments go all in. So I said earlier that the earliest adoption in Passkeys for consumer services has not been regulated industry. It's been e-commerce, payments, things where access first is important. This is the year where I think we're gonna start seeing banks deploy Passkeys for a minimum for sign-in and other things. And that's going to start changing the narrative on the suitability of Passkeys for regulated industry. I expect meaningful progress on that front in 2025. In fact, one major American bank has already implemented Passkeys today. The third one is deepfakes drive a biometric boom in enterprise security. So yes, just to reiterate, deepfake threat is real. You need to take this seriously and look for vendors that have certified solutions for things like identity verification, liveness detection, and things like that. That's a very important place to focus. The fourth bullet, Passkeys find expanded use in payments, including reducing reliance on SMS OTP. So related to the second bullet, we're seeing more and more financial services companies rely on Passkeys, but not just for sign-in. This is very important. A lot of the usability benefits can transfer over to payment authentication as well. So both Visa and MasterCard introduced payment Passkey services that bring the usability benefits and the security benefits of Passkeys for payment authentication as well. So I think that will be a growing space in 2025. And last but not least, no one's talked about wallets yet, I don't think. Christine's happy. Identity wallets gain steam and force standards work driven by Europe. So I find that I can't talk about identity and authentication without talking about wallets. So here's the wallet bit. Wallets are happening. I think everything kind of ultimately moves towards a place where credentials are stored, but it's a very fragmented space, and I think it will remain fragmented in 2025. But that initial work towards rationalizing wallets and what needs to be done to create some standards-based mechanisms to make them effective will happen this year, and FIDO Alliance will have a voice in that conversation. I promise you that. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Use Passkeys. Do we have time for questions or no?
Probably not.
Okay, I'll take one question, or you can find me in the hallway. Any questions? Okay, Congressman.
Someone selling fake Passkeys that have that codes.
So it's the hardware keys. Well, so we certify them. Or cell phones, yeah. So we do certified products, and so every certified token, for example, actually is certified, and then we have a register of those that tracks back, so people can verify whether or not those are a certified product or not. Now, if someone
inspections make sure someone has screwed the
actually insight, no, we don't do that right now as far as getting at the supply chain level. But no, we focus more on the certified products themselves. The L2 and L3. So I take so at the higher level. So for hardware authenticators themselves, at the higher levels of security authentication, L2 or L3 does verify, does add levels of verification about the manufacturing process and the integrity of the chip itself. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. So I just wanted to flag, while Andrew was giving his speech, Ryan Galuzzo from NIST, who has arrived, we thought we were going to lose him to illness, digging out the old, cleaning out the old NSTIC office, found the December 2012 cover of Wired, Kill the Password. which was written by Matt Honan after he had an epic hack when his passwords were compromised. We've been at this for a while.